In the bitter winter of 1889, when the railroad promised connection but often delivered separation, when progress meant displacement for those who couldn't afford to keep up, 6 young women would find themselves abandoned at a remote train station, with nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. Sometimes salvation comes not from the systems designed to protect us, but from the kindness of strangers who understand what it means to be forgotten by the world. Sometimes family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when everyone else walks away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the desolate platform of Millbrook Station like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would bury everything in its path. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, transforming the small Montana depot into an isolated island of misery, surrounded by an ocean of white. The single oil lamp that hung from the station's covered platform flickered weakly against the approaching darkness, casting dancing shadows that made the 6 figures huddled together appear like ghosts waiting for a train that would never come. 22-year-old Sarah Coleman pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked down at her 5 younger sisters, their faces pale with cold and exhaustion. The youngest, 8-year-old Emma, had stopped shivering an hour ago, which Sarah knew from hard experience was far more dangerous than the violent trembling that had racked the child's small frame throughout the afternoon. Sarah whispered. 16-year-old Rebecca, her voice barely audible above the wind. Emma's lips are turning blue. Sarah's heart clenched as she examined Emma's face. The little girl's eyes were glazed and unfocused, her breathing shallow and irregular. 14-year-old twins Mary and Martha pressed closer to their youngest sister, trying to share what little warmth their own undernourished bodies could provide. 18-year-old Hannah, always the practical one, was methodically tearing strips from her petticoat to wrap around Emma's feet, where her worn shoes had finally given up the battle against the elements. "We need to get inside somewhere," Sarah said quietly, though they all knew there was nowhere to go. The station house had been locked tight since the afternoon train had departed without them. The nearest town was 7 miles through deep snow, and none of them had eaten a proper meal in 2 days. How had it come to this? 3 weeks ago they had been living in their modest but comfortable home in St. Louis, still grieving the loss of their parents, but managing to maintain some semblance of normal life under Sarah's determined leadership. Their father, Thomas Coleman, had died of pneumonia the previous winter, leaving them with debts that consumed most of his modest savings. Their mother, Margaret, had followed him 6 months later, worn down by grief and the struggle to feed 6 daughters on seamstress wages, but they had survived. Sarah had taken over her mother's sewing clients, while Rebecca helped manage the younger girls. Hannah contributed what she could from her job at the local dry goods store, and even the twins had found small ways to earn pennies, running errands for neighbors, helping with laundry, watching younger children for working mothers. Then had come the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, bearing the official seal of the Missouri State Children's Relief Society. Sarah could still remember the way her hands had trembled as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the crisp official document that would destroy their world. "Dear Miss Coleman, it has come to the attention of this agency that 6 minor children are currently living without proper adult supervision at 412 Maple Street. While we understand that you have reached the age of majority, the state of Missouri does not recognize a sister as a suitable guardian for multiple minor children, particularly when said guardian lacks the financial means to provide adequate care. Therefore, you are hereby notified that arrangements have been made for the placement of Emma Coleman, age 8, Mary Coleman, age 14, Martha Coleman, age 14, Hannah Coleman, age 18, and Rebecca Coleman, age 16, inappropriate institutional care. The children will be collected on December 15th and transported to various facilities where they can receive proper education and moral guidance. As the eldest, you will be permitted to choose your own course, though we strongly recommend that you consider marriage or domestic service as the most suitable options for a woman of your station. Respectfully, Mrs. Constance Whitfield, Director, Missouri State Children's Relief Society. The letter had hit Sarah like a physical blow. Separated. Her sisters would be separated and sent to different institutions across the state, possibly never to see each other again. The twins torn apart after 18 years of never being more than a few feet from each other. Little Emma placed among strangers who didn't know that she had nightmares about wolves, or that she could only fall asleep if someone sang their mother's lullaby. Rebecca, so bright and eager to learn, condemned to an asylum for wayward girls simply because she had once been caught reading a book that someone deemed inappropriate for her station. Sarah had spent 3 sleepless nights formulating a plan that was desperate even by her own standards. Their father's brother, William Coleman, lived somewhere in Montana Territory. They had never met him. He had left Missouri 20 years earlier after a falling out with Thomas. But he was family. He had to help them. He had to. Using the last of their money, Sarah had purchased 6 train tickets to Millbrook Station, the closest depot to where her uncle was supposed to be running a cattle ranch. She had sold everything they couldn't carry, furniture, household goods, even her mother's wedding ring, to pay for the journey and buy supplies for what she hoped would be a brief trip to their new life. The journey had started hopefully enough. The older girls were excited about the adventure, and even Emma seemed to enjoy watching the countryside roll past the train windows. But as they traveled further west, Sarah began to notice disturbing details she had been too desperate to consider during her hasty planning. The conductor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes but a worried expression, had pulled her aside during a stop in Kansas City. "Miss, are you certain someone's meeting you in Millbrook? That's pretty isolated country, especially this time of year." Sarah had assured him that their uncle would be there, but the conductor's concern had planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each mile. When they finally reached Millbrook Station, those doubts had blossomed into full-blown terror. The station master, a gruff man named Pete Morrison, had looked at them with a mixture of pity and annoyance when Sarah inquired about William Coleman. "Coleman? Bill Coleman?" He had scratched his graying beard and squinted into the distance. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of Bill Coleman in near on 2 years. Word was he sold his spread and headed further west. Oregon, maybe. Could be California. By now?" The words had hit Sarah like an avalanche, burying her carefully constructed plans under the brutal weight of reality. 6 young women, alone in the wilderness, with less than $3 between them and winter closing in like the jaws of a trap. Morrison had been sympathetic but practical. "Look, miss, I'd help if I could, but my wife's been sick and we can barely feed ourselves. The afternoon train back east don't come through again until Thursday. That's 4 days from now. You got somewhere to wait?" They didn't. And as the hours passed and the temperature continued to drop, Sarah realized that Thursday might as well be next year. None of them would survive 4 days exposed to this weather without food or proper shelter. "Sarah," Hannah's voice was urgent now. "Emma's not responding. I think she's—" Before Hannah could finish her sentence, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the howling wind. Sarah looked up to see a rider emerging from the swirling snow like something from a dream. The horse was massive, a black gelding that seemed to tower above the snowdrifts, and its rider was proportionally large, easily 6.5 feet tall, even seated in the saddle, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to block out the storm itself. As the rider drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that showed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work but still held an essential kindness. His coat was the thick, practical wool of someone who understood winter survival, and his boots were the heavy leather of a man who worked with cattle and horses. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention as he dismounted and approached. Their huddled group, they were a deep brown, almost black in the dim light, and they held an expression of immediate concern and determination that reminded Sarah of her father during moments of crisis. "Ladies," the stranger said, his voice deep and calm despite the obvious urgency of the situation. "I'm Jake Thompson. Pete Morrison sent word that there might be folks stranded out here." He knelt down beside Emma, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he felt her forehead and checked her pulse. "This little one's in trouble. How long has she been like this?" "About an hour," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maybe longer. We've been here since yesterday afternoon, waiting for—" "Doesn't matter what you were waiting for," Jake interrupted, but not unkindly. "What matters is getting you all somewhere warm before this storm gets worse." He stood up, his full height, making him seem like a giant against the stormy sky. "My ranch is about 2 miles from here. Can the older girls ride double?" Sarah looked at her sisters, Rebecca shivering violently, Hannah trying to maintain composure while clearly exhausted, the twins supporting each other with the stubborn determination that had carried them through every crisis of their young lives. "We can try," she said. Jake nodded and let out a sharp whistle. Within moments, the sound of multiple horses approaching could be heard through the storm. 3 more riders emerged from the snow, all bundled against the cold, but clearly following Jake's lead. "Boys," Jake called to his companions, "we're taking these ladies to the ranch. Emma here needs warmth and medical attention right away." He lifted the youngest Coleman sister with the same care he might have shown a wounded bird, wrapping her in his own heavy coat before settling her in front of him on his massive horse. "Sir," Sarah began, wanting to explain their situation, to somehow convey that they weren't charity cases or helpless victims, but Jake held up a hand. "Miss, I don't know what brought you to Millbrook Station, and right now I don't care. What I care about is that there are 6 young women about to freeze to death on my watch, and that's not going to happen." His voice carried absolute conviction. "We'll sort everything else out once we get you warm and fed." As Sarah was helped onto a horse behind one of Jake's ranch hands, she felt something she hadn't experienced since reading that terrible letter from the Children's Relief Society. Hope. This giant of a man had appeared out of the storm, like an answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice, and his immediate, unquestioning commitment to their welfare suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, they might not have to face this crisis alone. The ride to Jake Thompson's ranch took nearly an hour through the deepening snow, but to Sarah it felt like a journey from despair to possibility. Behind them, Millbrook Station disappeared into the white darkness, taking with it the last remnants of their old life. Ahead lay uncertainty, but for the first time in weeks, uncertainty seemed preferable to the cold certainty of failure that had been consuming her. As they rode, Sarah found herself studying their rescuer. Jake Thompson moved with the natural ease of someone who had spent his entire life on horseback, but there was something else about him, a protective instinct that seemed to extend naturally to anyone in need. The way he held Emma, constantly checking to make sure she was warm and breathing properly, spoke of a man who understood responsibility and didn't shy away from it. When the lights of the Thompson Ranch finally appeared through the storm, Sarah felt tears freeze on her cheeks. The ranch house was large and solid, built from local timber and stone, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys and warm yellow light glowing from frost-covered windows. Outbuildings clustered around the main house like protective sentinels, and even through the storm, Sarah could sense the prosperity and stability that the Coleman sisters had never known. As Jake helped Emma down from his horse, Sarah realized that their real test was just beginning. They had found shelter from the storm, but they were still 6 homeless women with no money, no prospects, and no legal right to stay together. Jake Thompson might be willing to help them through the night, but what would happen when morning came and the full extent of their situation became clear? The answer to that question would determine whether they had merely postponed their separation or found the ally they desperately needed to keep their family intact. As Sarah followed her sisters through the ranch house's heavy front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The warmth that enveloped them as they crossed the threshold was more than just physical heat. It was the warmth of human kindness, of a place where people cared for each other, of the kind of home the Coleman sisters had thought they would never find again. But Sarah knew that acceptance and charity were two very different things, and she would need all of her courage and determination to convince Jake Thompson that 6 desperate young women deserved more than just temporary shelter from the storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Thompson ranch house wrapped around the Coleman sisters like a fortress against both the storm outside and the uncertainties of their future. As Jake carried Emma directly to a bedroom near the kitchen's massive wood stove, Sarah found herself standing in the main living area, taking in details that spoke of a life built on honest prosperity and careful stewardship. The furniture was handmade but substantial, chairs that could support Jake's considerable frame, a dining table large enough for a dozen people, and built-in shelves filled with books that suggested their host valued education alongside practical skills. Wool rugs covered polished wooden floors, and the stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a warmth that seemed to reach every corner of the room. "Mrs. Patterson," Jake called to an older woman who emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen. "We need hot soup, warm blankets, and your medical bag. The youngest girl has hypothermia." The woman, perhaps 60 years old with steel-gray hair and the competent bearing of someone accustomed to handling crises, took one look at the shivering group and immediately began organizing their care with military efficiency. "Hannah, you help me get the little one into dry clothes," she directed. "Rebecca and the twins, there's a washroom through that door. Get out of those wet things and into the robes hanging there. Sarah, you come with me. You look like you're about to collapse, and I need to know what medical conditions I'm dealing with." Within an hour, the Coleman sisters found themselves transformed from desperate refugees into guests being treated with a combination of practical care and genuine concern. Emma, wrapped in heated blankets and slowly sipping warm broth, had regained consciousness and most of her color. The twins were arguing quietly over who got the chair closest to the fire, which Mrs. Patterson assured Sarah was an excellent sign of recovery. But as the immediate crisis of survival passed, Sarah found herself facing an even more daunting challenge, explaining to Jake Thompson why 6 young women had been abandoned at a remote train station with nowhere to go. Jake sat across from her at the kitchen table, his large frame somehow managing to look both powerful and gentle as he waited for her to speak. Mrs. Patterson, who had introduced herself as Jake's housekeeper and the closest thing to family he had, bustled around the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be enough food for a cattle drive. "Now then," Jake said quietly, his voice pitched so the younger girls couldn't overhear, "why don't you tell me how 6 sisters from Missouri ended up stranded at Millbrook Station in the middle of a blizzard?" Sarah took a deep breath and began. With their parents' deaths, the mounting debts, and her efforts to keep the family together through honest work. Jake listened without interruption, his dark eyes growing increasingly serious as she described the letter from the Children's Relief. "Society, they were going to separate us," Sarah said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Send Emma to one orphanage, the twins to another, Rebecca to a reform school for girls whose only crime was being too smart for their own good. I couldn't let that happen. They're my sisters, not just my responsibility." when she finished with. Their failed attempt to reach their Uncle Jake was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Patterson had stopped pretending to work and was listening openly, her expression growing more indignant with each detail of their story. "Those government people," she said finally, her voice sharp with anger, "think they know better than family what's best for children. I've seen what happens in those institutions. Children aren't numbers to be processed and filed away." Jake rubbed his jaw, a gesture Sarah was beginning to recognize as his thinking pose. "The legal situation is complicated. Missouri authorities issued orders for your sister's placement. If they discover you fled the state with them, they could involve federal marshals." Sarah's heart sank. "So we can't stay anywhere. They'll keep hunting us until they find us and tear our family apart." "I didn't say that," Jake replied, his tone growing firm. "I said the legal situation is complicated. That doesn't mean it's hopeless." Mrs. Patterson set down the pot she had been scrubbing and faced them both. "Jake Thompson, I've worked for your family for 15 years, and I know what your father would have done in this situation. He'd have done exactly what you're doing now, helping people who needed help and worrying about the consequences later." Jake's expression softened slightly. "Pa always said a man's character is measured by how he treats people who can't do anything for him in return." He looked directly at Sarah. "But I need to be honest with you about what we're facing. If the authorities track you here, they won't just take your sisters. They'll charge me with kidnapping, harboring fugitives, interfering with legal custody orders. I could lose this ranch, go to prison." Sarah felt tears threaten again. "I understand if you can't help us. You've already saved our lives. If you could just give us enough supplies to reach the next town." "I'm not throwing you back out into the storm," Jake interrupted. "I'm explaining the stakes so you understand why we need a plan that goes beyond just hiding you here until spring." Before Sarah could ask what kind of plan he meant, the sound of approaching horses cut through the conversation. Jake immediately tensed, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. "3 riders," he said quietly. "Official look to them. Mrs. Patterson, keep the girls in the back rooms and keep them quiet." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Somehow, impossibly, the authorities had already tracked them down. After everything they had endured, after finding what seemed like sanctuary, their brief taste of safety was about to be ripped away. The knock that came at the front door was sharp and authoritative. Jake straightened his shoulders, and Sarah could see him mentally preparing for confrontation. But when he opened the door, the voice that greeted him wasn't that of a federal marshal or county sheriff. "Jake Thompson, I'm Deputy Marshal Frank Harrison from Helena. We received word that you might have encountered some travelers in distress." Sarah crept closer to the kitchen doorway, staying hidden but trying to hear the conversation. Through the crack, she could see a man in his 40s with the bearing of a career lawman, flanked by 2 younger deputies who looked cold and tired from their journey through the storm. "Marshal Harrison," Jake replied evenly. "What brings federal marshals out in weather like this?" "We're tracking 6 females who fled Missouri 3 days ago in violation of state custody orders. Sarah Coleman and her 5 sisters, ages 8 through 18. Their train tickets showed Millbrook Station as their destination." Jake's voice revealed nothing. "Lot of people come through Millbrook. Most don't stay long." "No, they don't. But Pete Morrison at the station said he directed some stranded travelers toward your ranch yesterday evening. Said there were 6 young women looked to be in considerable distress." Sarah held her breath, knowing that their entire future hung on Jake's next words. Would he turn them over to save himself? Would he lie to federal officers and risk everything? She wouldn't blame him if he chose his own safety over theirs. They were strangers who had brought nothing but trouble to his doorstep. "Marshal," Jake said slowly, "I think there might be some confusion about the nature of these custody orders. Are you here to arrest fugitives, or are you here to help children who were fleeing an unjust system?" Harrison's tone sharpened. The nature of the orders isn't for me to judge, Thompson. My job is to locate these individuals and ensure their return to proper authorities for placement in appropriate care facilities. Appropriate according to who? Have you seen these facilities? Do you know what happens to children who are separated from the only family they have left? I know what happens to men who interfere with federal custody orders, Harrison replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. Now, are you going to tell me whether you've seen these girls, or do I need to search your property? Sarah could see the moment when Jake made his decision. His shoulders straightened, and his voice took on a quality of absolute determination that reminded her of her father during his most protective moments. Marshal Harrison, I'm going to ask you to step inside out of this weather so we can discuss this situation properly. Because what you're dealing with here isn't a simple matter of runaway children. It's a matter of 6 young women who were about to be destroyed by a system that cares more about paperwork than people. As the marshal and his deputies entered the house, Sarah realized that Jake Thompson had just committed himself fully to their cause. He wasn't just offering temporary shelter anymore. He was openly defying federal authorities to protect a family. The stakes had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. From the back rooms, she could hear her sisters whispering nervously, sensing the tension even if they couldn't understand its full implications. Emma's young voice rose above the others. "Sarah, are the bad men here to take us away?" The question cut through Sarah like a knife, reminding her that their struggle wasn't just about legal principles or bureaucratic procedures. It was about a little girl who had already lost both parents and now faced losing her sisters as well. Jake's voice carried clearly from the main room as he addressed the marshal. "Before we go any further, I want you to meet the people you're here to collect. I want you to see what your custody orders actually mean for real human beings." Sarah knew this was the moment when their fate would be decided. Jake was forcing a confrontation that would either result in their protection or their immediate arrest. There would be no middle ground, no temporary reprieve, no time for careful planning. As she prepared to face the federal marshals who had been sent to tear her family apart, Sarah drew strength from the knowledge that she was no longer facing this battle alone. Jake Thompson had chosen to stand with them, knowing the full cost of his decision. The giant cowboy who had rescued them from the storm was about to discover whether his protection extended beyond the weather. The next few minutes would determine whether the Coleman sisters would finally find the home they desperately needed, or whether their brief taste of safety would end in separation and heartbreak. The sound of her sisters being called into the main room told Sarah that their moment of reckoning had arrived. Everything they had endured, everything they had risked, everything they had hoped for would be decided by what happened next. Jake Thompson had said he would help them fight for their family. Now they would discover whether one man's courage could stand against the full weight of federal authority and institutional power. The catalyst moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. The living room of the Thompson ranch house had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with Deputy Marshal Frank Harrison and his 2 deputies facing Jake Thompson across an invisible line of authority that neither man seemed willing to cross. Sarah stood beside Jake, her sisters arranged behind her like a human shield of determination and desperation. Marshal Harrison's experienced eyes swept over the group, taking in details that would inform his official report. 6 young women, clearly sisters based on similar bone structure and coloring, ages ranging from childhood to early adulthood. The youngest, Emma, clung to Rebecca's hand with the fierce grip of someone who had learned not to trust promises of safety. The twins, Mary and Martha, stood so close together they appeared to be a single entity, their identical expressions of defiant protectiveness making them seem older than their 14 years. "Miss Coleman," Harrison addressed Sarah directly, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Deputy Marshal Frank Harrison. I need you to understand that you're in violation of multiple state and federal laws by removing your sisters from Missouri without proper authorization. You've committed kidnapping, violated custody orders, and interfered with state welfare proceedings. Sarah felt her knees weaken, but Jake's presence beside her provided an anchor of strength. "Marshal Harrison," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need you to understand that those custody orders would have destroyed my family. The state wanted to send my sisters to different institutions across Missouri, some of them hundreds of miles apart. They would never have seen each other again. The state's primary concern is the welfare of minor children," Harrison replied. "These institutions provide education, moral guidance, and preparation for productive adult lives. What you're providing is uncertainty, instability, and now criminal fugitive status." Hannah stepped forward, her 18 years giving her more confidence than her younger sisters possessed. "Marshal, have you ever visited one of these institutions? Do you know what actually happens to girls who are sent there?" Harrison's expression tightened slightly. "Miss, I don't make policy. I enforce the law. And the law states that minor children require proper adult supervision and care, like the supervision Emma had when she nearly froze to death at Millbrook Station." Jake's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Marshal, I want to show you something." Jake moved to a wooden chest near the fireplace and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "3 years ago, I had occasion to investigate the conditions at the Riverside Home for Girls in Kansas City. That's where your custody orders would have sent Rebecca Coleman." He spread photographs across the dining table with deliberate precision. Sarah could see Marshal Harrison's jaw tighten as he examined images of overcrowded dormitories, children in patched and inadequate clothing, and facilities that appeared more suited for housing livestock than human beings. 47 girls, between the ages of 12 and 18, Jake continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone presenting evidence, sleeping in rooms designed for 20, working 14-hour days in the institution's commercial laundry for no wages, with the profits going to support the facility's operations. Educational instruction limited to 2 hours per week, focused primarily on Bible recitation and domestic service training. Mrs. Patterson moved closer to the table, her expression growing increasingly horrified. "Jake, where did you get these photographs?" "From a federal investigation that was quietly buried. When certain political contributors expressed their displeasure." Jake's eyes never left Harrison's face. "Marshal, the system you're here to enforce isn't protecting these children. It's exploiting them." Harrison studied the photographs for a long moment, his professional composure beginning to crack. "Even if these conditions exist in some facilities," he said finally, "that doesn't give private citizens the right to violate custody laws. There are proper channels for addressing institutional problems. Proper channels that take years while children suffer," Sarah interjected. "Marshal, how long do you think Emma would survive in one of these places? She's 8 years old, small, for her age, and she's already lost both parents. Separating her from her sisters would finish what pneumonia and grief started." The youngest Coleman sister, as if summoned by the mention of her name, pulled away from Rebecca and walked directly to Marshal Harrison. Her small face was pale but determined, and when she spoke, her voice carried the gravity of someone far older than her 8 years. "Mr. Marshal," Emma said, looking up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge of loss. "Are you here to take me away from Sarah?" Harrison's professional demeanor wavered visibly. "Little girl, the people in Missouri want to make sure you have proper care, education, and—" "I have proper care," Emma interrupted with the fierce certainty of childhood. "Sarah takes care of me. Rebecca teaches me to read. Hannah tells me stories. Mary and Martha make me laugh when I'm scared. We take care of each other just like Mama and Papa taught us." The marshal looked around the room, his gaze taking in the warm, clean environment, the evidence of the sisters' obvious affection for each other, and the determined faces of the adults who had chosen to protect them. For the first time since entering the house, he seemed uncertain about his mission. Jake sensed the moment and pressed his advantage. "Marshal Harrison, I want to propose an alternative to immediate arrest and deportation back to Missouri. Thompson, you're already in enough legal trouble without trying to negotiate federal law enforcement procedures." "Hear me out," Jake continued. "Montana Territory has different laws regarding guardianship and family preservation. If Sarah Coleman were to establish legal residence here, and if she could demonstrate the ability to provide adequate care and supervision for her sisters, territorial authorities might be willing to review the Missouri custody orders." Sarah stared at Jake, hardly daring to hope that such a solution might exist. "Is that actually possible?" Judge Patricia Wells in Helena has been known to prioritize family preservation over bureaucratic convenience, Jake replied. She's also been openly critical of the institutional system for orphaned children. If we could get your case before her court, we might be able to establish territorial jurisdiction and override the Missouri orders. Marshal Harrison's frown deepened. "You're talking about a complex legal process that could take months. Meanwhile, these individuals remain in violation of existing custody arrangements. What I'm talking about," Jake said firmly, "is the difference between justice and bureaucracy. Marshal, you took an oath to serve justice, not just to process paperwork. Look at these children and tell me that tearing them apart serves justice." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that Marshal Harrison's next decision would determine whether they had found sanctuary or simply delayed their inevitable separation. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Territorial jurisdiction over custody matters is complicated. It would require significant legal documentation and court approval. The process could take weeks or months. Weeks or months during which these children would remain together," Jake pointed out. "Weeks or months during which they would technically remain in violation of Missouri state orders," Harrison countered. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the desperate courage of someone with nothing left to lose. "Marshal Harrison, I know you have a job to do. I know we've put you in an impossible position, but I'm asking you to see past the legal technicalities to the human reality. These are my sisters, not just names on government forms. They've already lost everything that mattered to them except each other." She gestured toward her sisters, each one representing a piece of her heart that would be torn away if the authorities succeeded in their mission. "Emma still has nightmares about the night our mother died. Rebecca dreams of attending university and becoming a teacher. The twins have never been separated for more than a few hours in their entire lives. Hannah wants to write books that help people understand that families come in all different shapes and sizes." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing on reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. "If you take them back to Missouri, those dreams die. Their connection to each other dies. Everything our parents built, everything. They taught us about love and loyalty and taking care of family. It all disappears into institutional reports and bureaucratic procedures." Marshal Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the legal documents in his hand and the faces of the 6 young women who waited for his decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested years of making difficult choices between law and justice. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "hypothetically speaking, if these individuals were to establish territorial residence and initiate proper legal proceedings, how quickly could such a process be completed?" Jake's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah could see hope flickering in his eyes. Judge Wells typically schedules emergency custody hearings within 2 weeks of filing. If the case has merit, temporary custody arrangements can be established pending full review. And if the territorial court were to establish jurisdiction, would that supersede the Missouri orders? Territorial courts have authority over residents within their jurisdiction, particularly in matters involving the welfare of children, Jake replied. It's not unprecedented for one territory to challenge another state's custody decisions when those decisions appear to conflict with the best interests of the children involved. Harrison nodded slowly, as if reaching a decision that went against his training but aligned with his conscience. Miss Coleman, I came here with orders to arrest you and transport your sisters back to Missouri for institutional placement. However, territorial law does provide certain protections for families seeking to establish legitimate residence. Sarah's heart began to pound with something that might have been hope. What does that mean exactly? It means, Harrison said carefully, that if you were to establish legal residence in Montana Territory within the next 10 days, and if you were to file appropriate petitions with territorial authorities regarding custody of your sisters, federal law enforcement would be obligated to respect local jurisdiction pending resolution of those proceedings. The words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. Sarah looked at Jake, seeing her own amazement reflected in his expression. They had found a legal pathway that might allow the Coleman sisters to stay together. There are conditions, Harrison continued, his official tone reasserting itself. Legal residence requires genuine domicile, not just temporary shelter, employment or other means of financial support, community ties that demonstrate permanent rather than transient presence, and formal guardianship proceedings that satisfy territorial requirements for child welfare. Each condition felt like another mountain to climb, but Sarah had already proven that impossible odds didn't guarantee defeat. "We can do that," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we can do that." Jake nodded his agreement. "Marshall, Miss Coleman, and her sisters will have everything they need to establish legal residence and proper guardianship. You have my word on that." Harrison studied Jake's face intently. "Mr. Thompson, you understand that you're taking responsibility for ensuring compliance with all territorial requirements? That failure to meet these conditions would result in immediate federal intervention." "I understand completely," Jake replied without hesitation. "These young women have my full support in establishing their new life here in Montana as marshal." Harrison prepared to leave with his deputies. Sarah realized that their desperate flight from Missouri had transformed into something far more significant, the beginning of a legal battle that would determine whether family bonds could triumph over institutional authority, whether love and determination could overcome bureaucratic power. The alliance between Sarah Coleman and Jake Thompson had been forged in crisis, but it was being strengthened by shared commitment to a principle that transcended personal interests. The belief that families belonged together and that sometimes defying unjust laws was the most moral choice available. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but Sarah knew their real battle was just beginning. They had 10 days to establish legal residence, file court proceedings, and convince territorial authorities that 6 sisters belonged together rather than separated across institutional facilities. 10 days to prove that love was stronger than law, that family was more important than bureaucracy, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage began with a simple declaration: "You're all coming home." The morning after Marshal Harrison's departure dawned crisp and clear, the storm having blown itself out during the night and left behind a landscape transformed by pristine snow. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of the Thompson ranch house. watching Jake and his ranch hands begin the day's work with the efficient coordination of men who had worked together for years. For the first time in months, she had slept through the night without nightmares about losing her sisters. But peace, Sarah was learning, was often the calm before a more dangerous storm. Mrs. Patterson bustled around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, for what she cheerfully referred to as the expanded household. The older woman had embraced the Coleman sisters' presence with an enthusiasm that spoke of someone who had been managing a house meant for a large family, but occupied only by 2 people. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, setting a cup of coffee. At her elbow, "Jake wants to speak with you in his study after breakfast. He's been up since before dawn, working on those legal documents Marshal Harrison mentioned." Sarah nodded, though a flutter of anxiety disturbed her newfound sense of security. 10 days to establish legal residence seemed like an impossible deadline, and she had no idea what that process actually entailed. Her sisters had adapted to the ranch with remarkable speed. Emma had already befriended Jake's border collie, a patient old dog named Bear, who seemed to understand that the youngest Coleman sister needed a gentle protector. The twins were helping Mrs. Patterson with household tasks, their quick intelligence and willingness to work earning them obvious approval. Rebecca had discovered Jake's extensive library and was methodically reading her way through books on Montana territorial law. Hannah was exploring the ranch grounds, her natural curiosity leading her to ask detailed questions about cattle ranching that impressed Jake's experienced hands. It was Rebecca who brought the first hint of trouble. "Sarah," she said quietly as they finished breakfast, "I found something in one of Jake's law books that you need to see." In the study, Rebecca spread open a thick volume titled Territorial Guardianship Statutes and pointed to a section she had marked with a ribbon. "Look at this. According to Montana territorial law, guardianship of multiple minor children requires not just financial stability and suitable housing, but also," she paused, her finger tracing the relevant passage, "character witnesses from established community members, a formal hearing before a territorial judge, and most importantly, demonstration of moral fitness as determined by local religious and civic leaders." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What does moral fitness mean exactly?" "It means," Jake's voice came from the doorway, "that the territorial authorities will investigate every aspect of your background to ensure you meet their standards for proper guardianship. And there's something else we need to discuss." Jake entered the study carrying a telegram, his expression more serious than Sarah had yet seen it. "This came from my lawyer in Helena this morning. There's been a development we didn't anticipate." He handed Sarah the telegram, and she read it with growing alarm. "Urgent. Missouri authorities have contacted Territorial Governor regarding Coleman case. Stop claim. Sisters are part of organized effort to circumvent state custody laws. Stop requesting. Federal intervention to prevent territorial court review. Stop advise immediate legal representation." Attorney James Mitchell. Sarah looked up at Jake, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "Organized effort? What are they talking about?" Jake's jaw tightened. "They're claiming that your escape from Missouri is part of a larger conspiracy to help families evade state custody orders. They're suggesting that there's an underground network helping parents and siblings remove children from institutional placement." "But that's not true," Sarah protested. "We acted alone. We didn't know anyone in Montana. We barely knew our uncle existed." "The truth and what can be proven in court are sometimes 2 different things," Jake replied grimly. "And there's more. My lawyer's sources indicate that the Missouri Children's Relief Society has significant political connections in Washington. They've been lobbying for federal legislation that would standardize custody procedures across all states and territories, eliminating local jurisdiction in cases like yours." Rebecca looked up from the law book, her young face pale with understanding. They're using our case as an example of why local courts can't be trusted to make proper custody decisions. Jake nodded. If they succeed in getting federal intervention, it won't matter what Judge Wells decides. Federal authority would supersede territorial jurisdiction, and you'd be returned to Missouri regardless of local court findings. Sarah sank into a chair, feeling the weight of forces beyond her comprehension, closing in around them. So we're fighting not just for our family, but against people who want to change the law to prevent other families from staying together. Exactly. And there's something else you need to know about the people we're up against. Jake moved to his desk and withdrew a folder that Sarah hadn't seen before. After Marshal Harrison left last night, I sent some telegrams to contacts in Missouri and Washington. The responses have been illuminating. He spread documents across the desk, with the same methodical precision he had used when presenting evidence to Marshal Harrison. But these papers contained information that made Sarah's blood run cold. The Missouri Children's Relief Society isn't just a state welfare agency, Jake explained. It's part of a network of institutions across the Midwest that receives federal funding based on the number of children they process. More children in custody means more government money. They have a financial incentive to separate families. Sarah stared at financial reports that showed enormous sums of money flowing from federal agencies to state institutions, with payments calculated per child, per month, per year of institutionalization. They're making money from taking children away from their families, substantial money. And the woman who signed your custody orders, Constance Whitfield, sits on the board of directors for 3 different institutional facilities. She personally profits from every child placed in the system. Hannah, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. That's why they're so determined to get us back. We're not just children to them, we're income sources. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The woman who had written that cold, clinical letter about separating the Coleman sisters wasn't motivated by concern for their welfare. She was motivated by greed, by a system that turned human suffering into financial profit. There's more, Jake continued, his voice growing darker. Mrs. Whitfield has political connections that reach all the way to the Department of the Interior in Washington. She's been lobbying for legislation that would require all orphaned children to be placed in federally approved institutions, regardless of family wishes or local court decisions. Rebecca looked up from examining the financial documents. She wants to eliminate the possibility of families like ours staying together. She wants to make it illegal for territorial courts to override state custody orders. And if she succeeds, Jake said, it won't just affect your family. It will affect every family in the Western Territories who finds themselves facing similar circumstances. Parents who die young, siblings who try to stay together, relatives who want to provide care outside the institutional system, all of it would become impossible. Sarah felt the full weight of their situation settling on her shoulders. They weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They had become unwilling symbols in a battle over the fundamental nature of family, government authority, and children's rights. Jake, she said quietly, maybe we should just run. Keep running until we find somewhere they can't reach us. Alaska Territory, maybe. Or Mexico. Jake shook his head firmly. Sarah, running won't solve this. Even if you could stay ahead of federal marshals indefinitely, which is doubtful, you'd be condemning your sisters to a life of constant fear and instability. Emma deserves better than that. They all do. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening, from the kitchen doorway, entered the study with the determined expression of someone who had reached a decision. Jake Thompson, your father would never have run from a fight this important, and neither will his son. Jake looked at the older woman with surprise. Mrs. Patterson, this could destroy everything my family built. If we lose this battle, I could... Lose the ranch, face federal charges, spend years in prison. And if we don't fight, Mrs. Patterson replied with steel in her voice, how many other families will be torn apart by this corrupt system? How many other children will disappear into institutions that care more about profit than people? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her allies in a battle she had never chosen to fight. Jake, risking everything. He had built to protect strangers who had brought nothing but trouble to his doorstep. Mrs. Patterson, ready to support a fight that could cost her the only home and family she had known for 15 years. Rebecca, using her intelligence to research laws and procedures that could determine their entire future. "What do we need to do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. Jake smiled for the first time since reading. "The telegram. We need to move faster than our enemies expect. We need to establish legal residence, file custody petitions, and get a hearing before Judge Wells before federal authorities can intervene. We need to gather character witnesses, document your ability to provide proper care, and prepare legal arguments that will convince a territorial judge to defy both state and federal pressure. How long do we have?" "Less than 10 days now. My lawyer estimates that federal intervention could come within a week if Mrs. Whitfield's political connections prove as strong as they appear to be." Sarah felt determination replacing fear as she contemplated the challenge ahead. "Then we'd better get started." Over the following hours, the Thompson Ranch House transformed into a command center for legal warfare. Jake's contacts throughout Montana Territory were mobilized to provide character references and community support. Mrs. Patterson began documenting the living conditions and care arrangements that would demonstrate Sarah's fitness as a guardian. Rebecca continued her legal research, looking for precedents that might support their case. But as evening approached, a new complication arrived in the form of another telegram, this one addressed directly to Sarah. "Sarah Coleman, your actions have consequences beyond your family. Stop, return sisters to Missouri. Custody immediately, or face federal charges for kidnapping and conspiracy. Stop, you have 48 hours to comply. Stop, do not force us to involve local authorities in your apprehension. Stop." Constance Whitfield. The threat was clear and immediate. Mrs. Whitfield was no longer content to work through official channels. She was prepared to have Sarah arrested as a criminal, regardless of the legal proceedings they had initiated. Jake read the telegram with growing anger. "She's trying to force a crisis before we can get to court. If local law enforcement arrests you on federal kidnapping charges, it won't matter what Judge Wells might decide. You'll be in custody and your sisters will be returned to Missouri." Sarah looked at the telegram, seeing her worst fears spelled out in cold, bureaucratic language. But alongside the fear was something else, a burning anger at the injustice of a system that treated children as commodities and families as obstacles to profit. "Let her try," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. "We've come too far to surrender now." The dangerous revelation was complete. They now understood the true scope of their enemy's power and resources, the corrupt motivations behind the custody orders, and the broader implications of their struggle. But they also understood that retreat was impossible. The Coleman sisters had found allies willing to fight for them, and together they would face whatever consequences their defiance might bring. The next phase of their battle would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of countless other families caught in the machinery of an unjust system. The point of no return had been reached. There was no path forward except through the coming storm. The 48-hour deadline from Constance Whitfield's telegram hung over the Thompson Ranch like a sword suspended by fraying rope. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing through scenarios that all seemed to end with her sisters being dragged back to Missouri in shackles. But as dawn broke on what might be their last day of freedom, she was surprised to find Jake already up and preparing for what appeared to be a military campaign, rather than a legal proceeding. "We're not waiting for them to come to us," Jake announced as Sarah entered the kitchen to find him loading supplies into saddlebags. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to take the girls to the Hendersons' place. They're expecting you, and they understand the situation." Sarah's coffee cup clattered against the table. "Jake, what are you planning?" "I'm riding to Helena to file emergency custody petitions with Judge Wells personally. Sometimes the law moves faster when you put documents directly into a judge's hands instead of trusting them to the mail or telegraph system." Mrs. Patterson looked up from packing what appeared to be enough food for a siege. "And I'm taking the girls to Marcus and Ruth Henderson's ranch because their place is closer to town and they have better defensive positions if trouble comes calling." "Defensive positions?" Sarah stared at them both. "Are you expecting a fight?" Jake's expression was grim as he checked his pistol and rifle. "Sarah, Constance Whitfield didn't get where she is by accepting defeat gracefully. When that 48-hour deadline expires, she'll send people to collect you and your sisters, people who won't be as reasonable as Marshal Harrison." Before Sarah could process the full implications of Jake's words, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed cut through the morning air. Jake immediately moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "4 riders," he said tersely. "Coming fast. These aren't local folks paying a social call." Sarah felt her heart begin to pound as she recognized the lead rider. A man in the expensive Eastern suit who looked completely out of place in the Montana wilderness, but whose bearing spoke of authority and determination. Behind him rode 3 others, their clothing and equipment marking them as professional enforcers rather than federal marshals. "Get your sisters," Jake ordered. "Now, out the back door to the horses Mrs. Patterson prepared." But before Sarah could move, the front door burst open without ceremony. The man in the suit entered as if he owned the place, his pale eyes sweeping the room with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to taking inventory of other people's assets. "Miss Sarah Coleman," he said in a cultured voice that carried traces of an Eastern accent, "I am attorney Walter Grimsby, representing the Missouri Children's Relief Society. You will come with me immediately, along with your 5 sisters." Jake stepped between Grimsby and Sarah, his considerable size making the attorney appear almost frail by comparison. "Mr. Grimsby, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave before local law enforcement becomes involved." Grimsby smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Mr. Thompson, I think you'll find that local law enforcement is already involved." He gestured toward the door, and a 5th man entered, wearing a sheriff's badge and carrying official documents. "Sheriff Bradley Morrison," the newcomer announced. "I have warrants for the arrest of Sarah Coleman on charges of kidnapping, violation of custody orders, and conspiracy to circumvent state authority. I also have orders to take the 5 minor Coleman children into protective custody pending their return to Missouri." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. "Sheriff Morrison, you don't understand the situation. We're pursuing legal guardianship through territorial courts. Marshal Harrison said—" "Marshal Harrison exceeded his authority," Grimsby interrupted smoothly. "Federal review has determined that territorial courts lack jurisdiction over custody matters involving interstate flight from legal guardianship orders. The children will be returned to Missouri immediately." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her normally gentle demeanor replaced by something far more formidable. "Sheriff Morrison, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, your mother, and I served on the church committee together for 15 years. Are you really going to help tear apart a family that's done nothing wrong except try to stay together?" Sheriff Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't like this any more than you do. But the law is the law. These are federal warrants." "The law," Jake said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "also requires proper procedure. Sheriff, did you verify the authenticity of these warrants with federal authorities? Did you confirm that they were issued by a judge with proper jurisdiction? Grimsby's expression sharpened. Mr. Thompson, I strongly advise you not to interfere with law enforcement officers in the performance of their duties. I'm not interfering with anything, Jake replied calmly. I'm asking reasonable questions about legal procedures. Sheriff Morrison, who issued these warrants? Morrison shuffled through his papers, and Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. Well, they came through official channels. Mr. Grimsby here presented them with proper documentation from Missouri state authorities. But who signed them? Jake pressed. What federal judge issued warrants for arrest on charges that haven't been filed in any federal court? The silence that followed Jake's question was deafening. Sarah realized that Jake had identified a fatal flaw in their enemy's plan. In their haste to force a confrontation, they had overreached their legal authority. Grimsby's smooth confidence began to crack. The warrants are perfectly legitimate, issued under the authority of the Interstate Child Welfare Compact. The Interstate Child Welfare Compact, Rebecca's voice came from the kitchen doorway, requires formal extradition procedures and judicial review. It doesn't authorize immediate arrest and deportation. Sarah turned to see her 18-year-old sister holding one of Jake's law books, her finger marking a specific page. Despite the danger of their situation, she felt a surge of pride at Rebecca's courage and intelligence. According to Territorial Statute 247C, Rebecca continued, her voice steady despite her obvious fear, any arrest warrant issued by out-of-state authorities must be reviewed by local territorial judges before enforcement. Sheriff Morrison, have these warrants been reviewed by Judge Wells? Sheriff Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable. Well, no, but Mr. Grimsby assured me that federal authorities superseded local review requirements. Jake smiled grimly. Sheriff, I think you've been misled about the scope of federal authority in this case. Unless these warrants have been properly reviewed and approved by territorial courts, attempting to enforce them constitutes false arrest and kidnapping. Grimsby's professional composure finally cracked completely. This is nonsense. These children are property of the Missouri state system. They will be returned regardless of local legal technicalities. The word property hit the room like a thunderclap. Sarah saw Sheriff Morrison physically recoil, his expression shifting from uncertainty to disgust. Property? Morrison repeated. Mr. Grimsby, these are human beings, not cattle to be rounded up and shipped back east. They are minor children who belong in proper institutional care, Grimsby snapped, his mask of civilized authority slipping to reveal something ugly underneath. Their continued presence here represents a violation of state authority that will not be tolerated. Jake took a step forward, and Sarah could see barely controlled anger in his posture. Mr. Grimsby, I think you've overstayed your welcome. But Grimsby wasn't finished. Mr. Thompson, your interference in this matter has been noted by relevant authorities. Harboring fugitives, obstructing justice, conspiring to violate federal custody orders, these charges carry serious penalties. What charges carry serious penalties? Came a new voice from the doorway. Are making false arrests and impersonating federal officers. Sarah turned to see Marshal Harrison entering the house, flanked by 2 territorial deputies and carrying his own set of official documents. His expression was thunderous as he surveyed the scene. Sheriff Morrison, Harrison continued, I hope you haven't done anything irreversible based on Mr. Grimsby's questionable legal advice. Morrison looked relieved to see a genuine federal authority figure. Marshal Harrison, I was presented with warrants for Miss Coleman's arrest and orders to collect the children. Harrison examined the documents Morrison handed him, his frown deepening with each page. Sheriff, these aren't federal warrants. They're Missouri state documents with impressive seals and official-looking signatures, but they have no legal authority. Outside Missouri's borders, Grimsby made a final desperate attempt to salvage his mission. "Marshal, you're interfering with legitimate state authority." "No, Mr. Grimsby, I'm preventing you from committing multiple felonies." Harrison's voice carried the full weight of federal law enforcement. "Impersonating federal officers, issuing fraudulent arrest warrants, attempted kidnapping. Should I continue?" The three men who had accompanied Grimsby began to back toward the door, clearly recognizing that their mission had failed catastrophically. But Grimsby himself seemed incapable of accepting defeat. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Mrs. Whitfield has connections that reach all the way to Washington. These children will be returned to proper custody, and everyone who has aided their flight will face appropriate consequences." Harrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Mr. Grimsby, Mrs. Whitfield's connections are about to become a liability rather than an asset. The Department of Justice has opened a formal investigation into the financial arrangements between state custody agencies and private institutional facilities. Your employer's business model is about to face federal scrutiny." Sarah saw genuine fear replace anger in Grimsby's expression as the implications of Harrison's words sank in. The corrupt system that had made Constance Whitfield rich and powerful was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own greed. As Grimsby and his associates departed, their threats and bluster replaced by the urgent need to report their failure to their employer, Sarah realized that the confrontation had revealed far more than anyone had expected. The enemy's desperation had caused them to overplay their hand, exposing the fraudulent nature of their authority and the criminal methods they were willing to employ. But victory in this battle didn't mean the war was over. If anything, it had escalated to a level that would require all their courage and determination to survive. Marshal Harrison turned to address the assembled group, his expression serious, despite their tactical victory. "Folks, what happened here today is going to have consequences that reach far beyond Montana territory. Mrs. Whitfield and her associates have committed federal crimes in their attempt to circumvent proper legal procedures. But that also means they're going to become increasingly desperate and dangerous." Jake nodded grimly. "What's our next move, Marshal?" "Our next move is to get Miss Coleman and her sisters in front of Judge Wells as quickly as possible. Territorial jurisdiction needs to be established before our enemies can regroup and try a different approach." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had risked everything to protect her family. Jake, who had defied false authority and exposed criminal conspiracy. Mrs. Patterson, who had provided not just shelter, but fierce loyalty. Rebecca, who had used her intelligence to help defeat their enemy's legal deception. Marshal Harrison, who had chosen justice over bureaucratic convenience. The confrontation had revealed the true nature of their struggle, not just a battle for one family's survival, but a war against a corrupt system that treated children as commodities and families as obstacles to profit. But it had also revealed something else. They were no longer alone in this fight. They had allies who understood what was at stake, and they had enemies who were beginning to make mistakes born of desperation and overconfidence. The next phase of their battle would determine whether the Coleman sisters could finally find the legal protection they needed, or whether their enemies would find new ways to tear their family apart. As Sheriff Morrison departed with apologies and assurances of future cooperation, and Marshal Harrison began planning their immediate legal strategy, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Missouri: the possibility that they might actually win. The confrontation had built to a crescendo that exposed both the strength and weakness of their enemies. Now came the most dangerous part of their journey, the moment when seeming defeat would be transformed into unexpected victory, or when all their courage and determination would prove insufficient against forces beyond their control. The ride to Helena took place under an overcast sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty hanging over their mission. Sarah sat beside Jake on the wagon seat, her sisters bundled in the back with Mrs. Patterson, while Marshal Harrison and his deputies provided escort both ahead and behind. What should have been a routine journey to file legal papers had become something resembling a military convoy protecting precious cargo. Judge Patricia Wells had agreed to an emergency hearing based on Marshal Harrison's urgent telegram, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Constance Whitfield and her associates had proven themselves capable of corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. What would prevent them from attempting to influence or intimidate a territorial judge? "Jake," Sarah said quietly, as the outskirts of Helena came into view, "what if Judge Wells has already been compromised? What if we're delivering ourselves directly into their hands?" Jake's expression was thoughtful as he considered her concerns. "It's possible, but running indefinitely isn't a solution, and we can't fight this battle without legitimate legal authority on our side. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve something worthwhile." As they entered Helena's main street, Sarah was struck by the bustling activity of the territorial capital. Unlike the isolated ranch country they had traveled through, here was clear evidence of growth, prosperity, and the kind of established civilization that might offer real protection under law. The territorial courthouse was an imposing brick structure that dominated the center of town, its architecture conveying both permanence and authority. But as their convoy approached the building, Sarah noticed unusual activity around the entrance. Too many official-looking vehicles, too many men in expensive suits who didn't look like typical frontier lawyers. Marshal Harrison rode up beside their wagon, his expression grim. "There's been a development. Judge Wells' clerk sent word that the hearing has been moved to the larger courtroom to accommodate additional interested parties." "What kind of additional interested parties?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "The kind that arrive on private railroad cars and travel with their own legal teams," Harrison replied. Mrs. Whitfield came herself, along with representatives from the Department of the Interior and what appears to be a congressional fact-finding committee. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "They've turned our custody hearing into some kind of political circus." "Worse than that," Harrison said. "They've turned it into a test case for federal legislation that would strip territorial courts of jurisdiction over custody matters entirely. If they win here, they'll have precedent to override local authority throughout the Western Territories." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Their desperate attempt to keep their family together had somehow become the centerpiece of a national debate about states' rights, federal authority, and the treatment of orphaned children. The stakes had escalated far beyond anything she could have imagined. As they entered the courthouse, Sarah was overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who had gathered for what should have been a simple guardianship hearing. The large courtroom was packed with reporters, government officials, legal observers, and curious citizens who seemed to understand that they were witnessing something historically significant. At the plaintiff's table sat Constance Whitfield herself, a woman in her 50s with sharp features and cold eyes that spoke of someone accustomed to wielding power over others. Beside her sat a team of lawyers whose expensive clothing and confident bearing marked them as among the most skilled. Legal minds money could buy, but it was the man seated at the back of the courtroom who made Sarah's blood run cold. Tall, distinguished with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, he watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. When he turned his head, Sarah caught sight of a congressional pin on his lapel. "Congressman Bradley Ashford," Jake murmured, following her gaze, "chairman of the House Committee on Territorial Affairs. He's been pushing for legislation that would federalize all child welfare decisions in the territories." The pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place in Sarah's mind. Their case wasn't just about 6 sisters trying to stay together. It had become a weapon in a political battle over the future of territorial autonomy and federal control. Judge Patricia Wells entered the courtroom with the measured dignity of someone who understood the historical weight of the moment. She was a woman in her early 60s, with grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that suggested both intelligence and uncompromising dedication to justice. "This court will come to order," Judge Wells announced, her voice carrying clearly throughout the packed courtroom. "We are here to consider the petition of Sarah Coleman for legal guardianship of her 5 minor sisters, and the counter-petition of the Missouri Children's Relief Society for enforcement of existing custody orders." Constance Whitfield's lead attorney, a distinguished man who introduced himself as Charles Morrison, rose to present the state's case. His argument was polished, professional, and completely devoid of human compassion. "Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental challenge to the authority of state governments to protect vulnerable children through established institutional care systems. The defendant's flight from Missouri with 5 minor children constitutes a kidnapping, violation of lawful custody orders, and an attempt to use territorial jurisdiction to circumvent legitimate state authority." Morrison continued for nearly an hour, presenting a case that portrayed Sarah as a misguided young woman whose romantic attachment to a Montana rancher had caused her to endanger her sister's welfare through reckless flight from proper legal guardianship. But it was when Morrison began describing the benefits of institutional care that Sarah realized their enemies had made a crucial mistake. In his zeal to present the Missouri system as superior to family care, he began detailing the efficiency of institutional processing, the cost-effectiveness of centralized care, and the standardization that large facilities could provide. Judge Wells's expression grew increasingly skeptical as Morrison inadvertently revealed the business-like nature of the system he was defending. When he mentioned the economies of scale that made large institutions financially viable, Sarah saw something shift in the judge's demeanor. Jake's lawyer, James Mitchell, rose to present their defense with a very different approach. Instead of legal technicalities or jurisdictional arguments, he began with a simple question. "Your Honor, what is the primary purpose of child welfare law?" "The protection and best interests of children," Judge Wells replied without hesitation. "Then let us examine what serves the best interests of the Coleman children," Mitchell continued. He called Sarah to the witness stand first, allowing her to tell their story in her own words. The loss of their parents, the struggle to maintain their family unit, the desperate flight from a system that would have separated them forever. But the real turning point came when Mitchell called an unexpected witness, Dr. Margaret Hartwell, a physician who had spent the previous 2 weeks conducting medical and psychological examinations of institutional facilities throughout the Midwest. "Dr. Hartwell," Mitchell asked, "based on your recent research, what can you tell this court about the actual conditions in facilities like those operated by the Missouri Children's Relief Society?" Dr. Hartwell's testimony was devastating. She presented photographic evidence, medical records, and first-hand observations of overcrowding, inadequate nutrition, educational neglect, and systematic abuse that characterized the institutional system Constance Whitfield represented. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Hartwell concluded, "removing these children from their family environment and placing them in institutional care would constitute a form of child abuse sanctioned by the state." Constance Whitfield's composed facade finally cracked. She rose from her seat, her voice sharp with anger. "Your Honor, this testimony is irrelevant character assassination designed to discredit legitimate state authorities." Judge Wells's response was crisp and decisive. "Mrs. Whitfield, the conditions in facilities under your supervision are highly relevant to determining whether returning children to those facilities serves their best interests. But the most dramatic moment came when Mitchell called his final witness, a young woman named Elizabeth Harper, who had lived in the Riverside Home for Girls, the same facility where Rebecca Coleman would have been sent. Elizabeth's testimony was quiet, matter-of-fact, and absolutely devastating. She described years of psychological abuse, educational neglect, forced labor in commercial laundries, and systematic punishment for any attempt to maintain contact with family members. The hardest part, Elizabeth said, her voice barely audible, wasn't the work or the poor food or the crowded conditions. It was losing hope that anyone cared whether I lived or died. The staff made it clear that we were burdens to be managed, not children to be protected. The courtroom was silent as Elizabeth's words hung in the air. Sarah could see tears in the eyes of spectators, reporters frantically taking notes, and Congressman Ashford looking decidedly uncomfortable with the direction the hearing had taken. Judge Wells called for a brief recess, during which Sarah overheard fragments of heated conversation from the government tables. Words like political disaster and congressional inquiry suggested that the federal officials had not expected their model case to expose such damaging evidence about the system they were trying to protect. When court reconvened, Judge Wells's decision was swift and uncompromising. This court finds that the best interests of the Coleman children are served by remaining with their sister, Sarah Coleman, under territorial guardianship. The Missouri custody orders are hereby declared invalid within Montana Territory on grounds that they would subject minor children to conditions that constitute abuse and neglect. The courtroom erupted in applause and shouts of both celebration and protest. But Judge Wells wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court recommends that federal authorities conduct a comprehensive investigation into the institutional facilities operated by the Missouri Children's Relief Society, and that Congress reconsider any legislation that would strip territorial courts of authority to protect children from abusive state custody arrangements. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the full impact of the decision hit her. They had won, not just the legal battle, but the moral victory that would protect other families from similar persecution. But their victory came with immediate consequences. As they left the courthouse, Marshal Harrison pulled Jake aside with urgent news. There's been a development. The Department of Justice investigation that I mentioned earlier. It's moved beyond financial irregularities into criminal conspiracy charges. They've issued warrants for Mrs. Whitfield and 12 other officials across 3 states. The scope of the corruption they had helped expose was staggering. What had begun as one family's desperate attempt to stay together had unveiled a network of institutional abuse and financial fraud that reached from Missouri to Washington, D.C. As they prepared for the journey back to the ranch, Sarah realized that their story was far from over. Judge Wells' decision had given them legal protection, but it had also made them symbols of resistance to powerful interests that wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. The turning point had been reached. Justice had triumphed over corruption, family had prevailed over institutional greed, and truth had overcome political manipulation. But victory often comes with a price, and Sarah suspected that the full cost of their triumph was yet to be revealed. As they left Helena behind and headed toward what they hoped would finally be home, she could only pray that their allies would prove strong enough to protect what they had fought so hard to win. The Coleman sisters were finally free to stay together. Now they had to learn whether that freedom could be defended against the forces that would inevitably seek to destroy it. 3 weeks after Judge Wells's landmark decision, the Thompson Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt almost too peaceful. After months of crisis and uncertainty, Sarah stood in the kitchen, watching through the window as Emma helped Jake train a young colt in the corral. The sight of her youngest sister laughing as the horse nuzzled her hand represented a kind of normalcy the Coleman family had never known, not just survival, but genuine happiness. The legal victory in Helena had triggered a cascade of consequences that continued to reshape the landscape of child welfare throughout the Western Territories. Federal investigators had descended on institutional facilities across Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska, armed with warrants and accompanied by journalists whose reports were exposing decades of systematic abuse and financial corruption. Mrs. Patterson entered the kitchen, carrying a stack of letters and newspapers, her expression mixing satisfaction with continued amazement at the national attention their case had generated. "Sarah, dear, you need to see these. Letters from families throughout the territories who are fighting their own custody battles. They're using Judge Wells' decision as precedent to challenge institutional placements." Sarah examined the correspondence. With wonder, letters from Colorado, Wyoming, Utah Territory, all from families who had found hope in the Coleman sisters' victory. A widowed father in Denver fighting to keep his 3 sons together. A grandmother in Salt Lake City seeking custody of her orphaned grandchildren. Siblings in Cheyenne whose parents had died in a mining accident and who were facing separation into different facilities. "We've started something bigger than we intended," Sarah murmured, reading testimony from a congressional hearing where Judge Wells had been called to defend territorial jurisdiction in child welfare cases. "You've finished something that needed finishing," Jake corrected, entering the kitchen with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose morning work had gone well. "The corruption in that system was destroying families long before you came along. You just had the courage to fight back when it threatened your own." The newspapers Mrs. Patterson had brought contained updates on the criminal prosecutions that had grown out of their case. Constance Whitfield had been arrested on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and criminal abuse. 12 other officials across 3 states were facing similar charges. The Missouri Children's Relief Society had been placed under federal oversight, pending complete reorganization. But perhaps most significantly, the congressional hearings had resulted in the defeat of Representative Ashford's legislation that would have federalized all territorial custody decisions. Instead, Congress was considering new laws that would strengthen family preservation and require federal oversight of institutional facilities. "Listen to this," Rebecca said, entering with her own selection of newspapers. "The Chicago Tribune is calling our case a watershed moment in the fight for children's rights. The Denver Post says Judge Wells' decision represents a victory for common sense over bureaucratic tyranny." Hannah looked up from the letter she was writing at the kitchen table. "I've been corresponding with Elizabeth Harper, the young woman who testified about conditions at the Riverside home. She's been asked to speak before a Senate committee investigating institutional abuse." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that Elizabeth's courage in testifying had opened doors for systemic reform that would protect other children from similar experiences. Their battle had created a platform for voices that had been silenced by institutional authority for too long. The sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the window, where Marshal Harrison could be seen leading a small group toward the ranch house. But unlike his previous visits, this one appeared celebratory rather than urgent. The riders were moving at a relaxed pace, and Harrison was smiling broadly. "Good news, I hope," Jake said as he went to meet their visitors. "Marshal." Harrison dismounted with the satisfied bearing of a lawman who had successfully completed a challenging case. Behind him were 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, one wearing the badge of a federal marshal, the other dressed in the expensive clothing of a government official. "Miss Coleman," Harrison called as the group approached the house, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Attorney General William Crawford from Washington. He's here with news about the federal investigation." Crawford was a man in his 50s, with the authoritative bearing of someone accustomed to high-level government work, but his expression was warm as he shook Sarah's hand. "Miss Coleman, I want to personally thank you for your courage in exposing the corruption we've been investigating. Your case provided the key evidence we needed to bring criminal charges against a network of officials who had been operating with impunity for years." "What's the status of the prosecutions?" Jake asked. "Constance Whitfield has accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against her co-conspirators," Crawford replied. "She'll serve 8 years in federal prison and pay substantial restitution to families who were harmed by her organization's practices. More importantly, she's provided evidence that has led to charges against officials in 7 states. The federal marshal, who introduced himself as Thomas Bennett, added details that demonstrated the scope of corruption the Coleman case had helped reveal. "We've identified a network of private contractors who were billing state governments for institutional care while providing substandard conditions. The financial fraud alone totals more than $2 million across multiple states." Sarah tried to comprehend the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Their desperate flight from Missouri had exposed criminal activity involving millions of dollars and hundreds of children across the western United States. "There's more," Crawford continued. "The Department of Justice is establishing new oversight procedures for all institutional facilities that receive federal funding, regular inspections, standardized care requirements, and most importantly, preference for family-based care whenever possible." Mrs. Patterson invited the visitors into the house, where the conversation continued over coffee and the kind of substantial meal that had become her signature response to any significant occasion. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah learned about changes that would reshape child welfare policy for generations. Federal legislation was being drafted to establish children's rights as a protected category under law. State institutions would be required to demonstrate that family separation served children's best interests rather than administrative convenience. Most significantly, territorial courts would be given expanded authority to override state custody decisions when those decisions conflicted with children's welfare. "Judge Wells has been asked to head a federal commission on territorial family law," Crawford revealed. "Her decision in your case has become the foundation for a new approach to child welfare that prioritizes family preservation over institutional processing." As evening approached and their visitors prepared to depart, Marshal Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "There's one more thing you should know. The case has attracted attention from some powerful people who believe in what you've accomplished." He handed her a letter bearing the seal of the Montana Territorial Governor. "Read it when you're ready. It contains an offer that might interest you." After their guests departed, the Coleman sisters gathered in the living room while Sarah opened the governor's letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the formal prose that contained an offer she had never imagined possible. "The territory of Montana," she read aloud, "recognizes the extraordinary service performed by Miss Sarah Coleman in exposing corruption and defending family rights. We hereby offer Miss Coleman appointment as Territorial Advocate for Children's Welfare, with authority to investigate custody disputes, recommend policy changes, and ensure that territorial law serves the best interests of children and families." The silence that followed was broken by Emma's excited voice. "Sarah, does that mean you'd be like a judge for children?" "More like someone who makes sure judges do the right thing for families like ours," Rebecca explained, her pride in her older sister evident in her expression. Sarah looked around the room at her sisters, each one representing a piece of her heart that would have been torn away if their enemies had succeeded. Emma, bright and curious, was already talking about starting school in the local town. The twins had discovered a talent for ranch work and were learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Rebecca was planning to attend the Territorial Teachers College, her dreams of education finally within reach. Hannah had begun writing articles for regional newspapers, using her experience to advocate for other families facing similar challenges. "What do you think?" Sarah asked them. "Should I accept?" The unanimous enthusiasm of their response told her everything. She needed to know. They had found not just safety and legal protection, but purpose. Their struggle had become part of something larger, a movement to protect families and reform systems that had prioritized convenience over compassion. That evening, as Sarah sat on the ranch house porch watching stars emerge in the Montana sky, Jake joined her with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable silence of shared understanding. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she had been a desperate young woman with no options and no hope. Tonight, she was surrounded by family, supported by allies, and offered opportunities she had never dreamed possible. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude." Jake nodded, his own satisfaction evident in the relaxed set of his shoulders and the contentment in his expression. "Mrs. Patterson was right about what my father would have done. He always said that helping people in trouble wasn't charity, it was investment in the kind of community you want to live in." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The train station where they had nearly frozen to death seemed like something from another lifetime. The fear and desperation that had driven them across state lines had been replaced by security and purpose. The Coleman sisters had found more than sanctuary at the Thompson Ranch. They had found home, not just a place to live, but a place where they belonged, where their contributions mattered, where their dreams could grow into reality. Justice had been served, not just for their family, but for countless others who would benefit from the reforms their case had initiated. Corrupt officials faced prison sentences. Abusive institutions faced federal oversight. Children's rights had been strengthened throughout the Western Territories. But perhaps most importantly, they had proven that ordinary people could make a difference when they found the courage to stand up for what was right. 6 sisters and 1 determined cowboy had challenged a corrupt system and won, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after them. As Sarah prepared to accept the territorial appointment that would allow her to continue fighting for families in crisis, she understood that their story was both ending and beginning. The immediate battle for their survival was over, but their mission to protect other families was just starting. The giant cowboy who had rescued 6 freezing sisters from a train station had done more than save their lives. He had helped them discover their own strength, their own purpose, and their own power to create change in a world that too often seemed indifferent to human suffering. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to protect, new battles to fight. But tonight, the Coleman sisters were home, they were together, and they were free to face whatever came next with the confidence that love, courage, and determination could triumph over any obstacle. The resolution was complete. Justice had prevailed, and 6 sisters, who had once faced separation and despair, were now ready to spend their lives ensuring that no other family would have to endure what they had overcome. They had all come home, in every sense that mattered. 25 years later, Helena, Montana, 1915, the autumn wind carried the sound of children's laughter across the grounds of the Coleman Family Advocacy Center, a sprawling complex of buildings that had grown from a single office into one of the most respected child welfare institutions in the American West. Sarah Coleman Thompson stood at the window of her office, watching as her own twin daughters played with a group of children whose families had found refuge and support within these walls. At 47, Sarah had grown into the kind of woman who commanded respect through competence rather than authority, whose silver-streaked hair and laugh lines spoke of someone who had found genuine purpose in her life's work. The scared 22-year-old, who had once huddled with her sisters at Millbrook Station, seemed like a character from someone else's story, though the determination that had saved her family remained as strong as ever. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections, and Rebecca Coleman Davis entered, carrying a thick folder and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just concluded successful negotiations. At 41, Rebecca had become one of the most influential educators in Montana, serving as superintendent of territorial schools while maintaining her role as Sarah's closest advisor in matters of child advocacy. "The legislature approved our funding request," Rebecca announced, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Full appropriation for the next 5 years, plus authorization to expand operations into Wyoming and Colorado territories." Sarah felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that accompanied each victory in their ongoing mission to reform child welfare systems throughout the West. The Coleman Family Advocacy Center had grown from a single woman's territorial appointment into a multi-state organization that provided legal representation, family support services, and policy advocacy for thousands of families each year. "What convinced them?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "The same thing that's been convincing legislators for 25 years, Rebecca replied with a smile. "Results. Last year we kept 847 families together who would have been separated under the old institutional system. We've placed 312 children with relatives instead of strangers. And we've documented cost savings of over $300,000 annually compared to institutional care." The numbers represented more than administrative success. They represented individual children who grew up with siblings instead of alone, families who stayed together instead of being torn apart, communities that remained strong instead of being weakened by bureaucratic intervention. Sarah's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma Coleman Mitchell, now 33, and serving as the center's chief investigator. The youngest, Coleman's sister, had grown into a formidable woman whose childhood experiences had shaped her into one of the most effective advocates for children's rights in the region. "Sarah, we need to discuss the Henderson case in Billings," Emma said, spreading photographs and documents across the desk. 3 children, ages 6 to 12, parents died in a factory accident. The state wants to separate them into different facilities because there's no single institution with space for all 3. Sarah studied the photographs of 3 young faces that reminded her powerfully of her own sisters at similar ages. The same mixture of grief, fear, and desperate hope that had characterized their own crisis 25 years earlier. "What are our options?" Sarah asked, though she was already mentally mobilizing resources. The maternal grandmother is willing and able to take custody, but she lives in Idaho territory and the Montana authorities are claiming jurisdictional complications, Emma replied. "Standard bureaucratic obstruction disguised as proper procedure." Rebecca looked up from her own files. "Sounds familiar. What's our legal position?" "Strong, thanks to the precedents we've established over the past 2 decades, Emma said with satisfaction. "The Henderson case actually falls under the Interstate Family Preservation Act that Congress passed after our initial victory. We can invoke federal jurisdiction to override state custody decisions when family placement is available." Sarah nodded, already planning their strategy. "File the necessary petitions, contact Judge Morrison in Billings. She's been reliable in family preservation cases, and arrange temporary foster placement with the Murphy family until we can complete the interstate transfer." The efficiency with which they addressed the Henderson case reflected 25 years of experience in fighting for families against bureaucratic systems that still prioritized administrative convenience over human welfare. Each case built on previous victories, each success creating precedent and authority for the next battle. As Emma departed to implement their plan, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary changes that had transformed child welfare throughout the western United States since their own struggle at Millbrook Station. The institutional system that had once threatened to separate the Coleman sisters had been completely restructured. Federal oversight required regular inspections, standardized care protocols, and most importantly, preference for family-based solutions whenever possible. The profit motive that had driven corrupt officials like Constance Whitfield had been eliminated through new funding structures that rewarded successful family preservation rather than institutional processing. But perhaps more significantly, the legal framework had evolved to recognize children's rights as a fundamental principle of American law. The Coleman Family Advocacy Center had participated in landmark Supreme Court cases that established children's right to family connection, educational opportunity, and protection from institutional abuse. "Mrs. Thompson," came a voice from the doorway, "your 4 o'clock appointment is here." Sarah looked up to see her secretary announcing the arrival of a young woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, carrying herself with the determined bearing of someone facing a crisis that required immediate resolution. "Miss Jennifer Walsh," the secretary continued, "regarding the custody situation in Missoula." Sarah immediately recognized the pattern. Another family crisis, another desperate young woman seeking help to keep siblings together against bureaucratic pressure. The cycle continued. But now there were resources and legal frameworks to provide genuine assistance instead of mere sympathy. Jennifer Walsh entered the office with the hesitant confidence of someone who had heard that help might be available, but wasn't entirely convinced it was real. She was perhaps 24 years old, with auburn hair and worried eyes that reminded Sarah of her own reflection from a quarter-century earlier. "Miss Walsh," Sarah said warmly, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs arranged near the window. "Please, tell me about your situation." Jennifer's story unfolded with familiar elements. Parents lost to influenza, 4 younger siblings facing separation into different institutional facilities, a bureaucratic system that claimed to act in the children's best interests while ignoring their emotional and family needs. "They want to send my brother Timothy to the state home in Butte, my sisters Mary and Catherine to the girls' facility in Great Falls, and little Joseph to a special school in Bozeman for children with learning difficulties," Jennifer said, her voice breaking with the strain of holding her family together. "They say it's for their own good, that specialized care will serve them better than keeping them with someone who's barely an adult herself." Sarah listened with the patience of someone who had heard similar stories hundreds of times, each one unique in its details, but universal in its core tragedy. The system had improved dramatically since her own experience, but bureaucratic inertia and administrative convenience still threatened families who lacked the knowledge and resources to fight back effectively. "Jennifer," Sarah said when the young woman finished her story, "you've come to the right place. What you're describing is exactly the kind of situation our organization was created to address." Over the following hour, Sarah explained the legal options available, the support services the center could provide, and the network of allies they had built throughout the territorial court system. Jennifer's expression gradually shifted from desperation to hope as she realized that her family's battle was winnable. "The most important thing to understand," Sarah concluded, "is that you're not alone in this fight. 25 years ago, I sat in a very similar position, facing the same kind of bureaucratic pressure to accept the separation of my family. We won that battle, and we've spent the past quarter-century making sure other families can win theirs. As Jennifer departed with a folder full of legal documents and contact information. Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from transforming her own painful experience into effective advocacy for others. The Coleman sisters' desperate flight from Missouri had become a legacy of protection and empowerment for families throughout the American West. The late afternoon brought another familiar ritual, the arrival of her sisters for their weekly family dinner, a tradition they had maintained through marriages, children, career demands, and the inevitable changes that came with building adult lives. Hannah Coleman Wright arrived first, her success as a novelist having made her one of the most respected voices in Western literature. Her books, which drew heavily on their family's experiences, had helped shape public understanding of child welfare issues while entertaining readers with stories of courage, determination, and family loyalty. "Sarah," Hannah announced as she entered the office, "the publisher wants to discuss a new project, a comprehensive history of child welfare reform in the American West. They're talking about a multi-volume series that would document everything. From our initial case through current policy developments." The twins, Mary Coleman Foster and Martha Coleman Hughes, arrived together as they had for everything else in their lives. Both had become successful ranchers' wives, but they had also served as unofficial advocates within their communities, helping other families navigate custody crises and bureaucratic challenges. "We've been thinking about the Henderson case," Mary said as they settled into Sarah's office for their weekly strategy session. "The Idaho grandmother situation is more complicated than Emma realized." Martha nodded, continuing her twins' thought. With the seamless communication they had maintained since childhood, the grandmother is willing to take the children, but she's facing financial pressure from creditors who think 3 additional children might push her into bankruptcy. Sarah felt the familiar stirring of strategic thinking that had made her effective in these complex family situations. What kind of financial support would stabilize the situation? "About $300 to clear existing debts, plus ongoing assistance with child-related expenses," Mary replied. "The center's emergency fund could cover the immediate needs." Rebecca, who had been listening while reviewing case files, looked up with practical concerns. "The emergency fund has been heavily used this quarter. The Thompson family crisis in Butte, the irrigation disaster in Great Falls that left dozens of families without income, the mining accident near Anaconda." Sarah calculated quickly, balancing immediate family needs against long-term organizational sustainability. "We'll cover the Henderson case from emergency funds, but we need to increase our fundraising efforts for the next quarter." The conversation continued for another hour, covering active cases, policy developments, and strategic planning for expanding their operations into additional territories. But Sarah's attention was partly focused on the larger picture. 6 sisters who had once faced separation and despair, now working together to ensure that other families could stay together and thrive. As evening approached and her sisters prepared to return to their own families, Sarah walked with them through the grounds of the center, past buildings that housed legal offices, family counseling services, emergency shelter facilities, and educational programs. Children played in the courtyard while their parents attended support group meetings or consulted with advocates about their own family challenges. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices?" Emma asked as they paused near the memorial garden dedicated to families who had been separated by the old institutional system. Sarah considered the question as she had many times over the years. "I think about the Henderson children, the Walsh siblings, all the families we've helped over the past 25 years. I think about the policy changes, the legal precedents, the institutional reforms, and I realize that our choices created ripples that extended far beyond our own family." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "Judge Wells said something interesting at the policy conference last month. She said our case didn't just change law, it changed the way people think about children's rights and family preservation. Hannah smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent years documenting their story and its impact. The letters I receive from readers tell me that our experience has inspired families across the country to fight for their rights instead of accepting separation as inevitable. As Sarah walked home through the familiar streets of Helena, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that desperate night at Millbrook Station to their current position as leaders in child welfare reform. The scared young woman who had fled Missouri with her sisters had grown into someone whose work influenced policy at the federal level, whose organization protected thousands of families annually, whose example had inspired a generation of advocates. The Thompson Ranch, where Jake waited with their own children and grandchildren, represented the stability and security that had eluded the Coleman sisters throughout their childhood. But more than personal happiness, it represented the foundation from which they had built something larger, a network of protection and advocacy that ensured other families could find the help they needed when facing their own crises. That evening, as 3 generations of the Thompson-Coleman family gathered around the dinner table, Sarah looked at faces that reflected the full spectrum of their shared journey. Her daughters, now adults with children of their own, who had grown up understanding that family loyalty was both a privilege and a responsibility. Her grandchildren, who took for granted rights and protections that had been won through years of struggle and advocacy. Jake, now in his 70s, but still possessing the quiet strength that had made him willing to risk everything for 6 desperate young women, raised his glass in a toast that had become their family tradition. To those who came before, who made difficult choices so we could have better ones. To those who come after, who will inherit the world we've tried to build. And to the understanding that family means whoever shows up when you need them most. The toast encompassed not just their biological family, but the extended network of advocates, allies, and supporters who had joined their mission over the years. Marshall Harrison, now retired, but still serving as a board member of the center. Mrs. Patterson, whose fierce loyalty had provided stability during their most difficult moments. Judge Wells, whose courageous decisions had established legal precedents that protected families throughout the West. As the evening continued with the comfortable rhythms of family conversation, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader legacy of their struggle. The Coleman Family Advocacy Center was just one visible symbol of changes that had transformed child welfare throughout the American territories. Federal legislation now required family preservation as the primary goal of custody decisions. State institutions operated under strict oversight and accountability standards. Children's rights were recognized as fundamental principles of American law, but perhaps, most importantly, the cultural understanding of family had evolved to recognize that love, loyalty, and commitment mattered more than traditional structures or bureaucratic convenience. Families came in many forms: siblings caring for siblings, grandparents raising grandchildren, communities supporting families in crisis, and the law now protected that diversity instead of trying to force everyone into institutional models. The next morning brought news that perfectly illustrated how far they had come. A telegram from the territorial governor announced that Montana had been selected as the site for the first national conference on child welfare reform, bringing together advocates, policymakers, and reformers from across the United States to share successful strategies and plan future initiatives. Sarah, Rebecca said as they reviewed the conference planning materials, they want you to give the keynote address. The theme is From Crisis to Hope, 25 years of family advocacy. Sarah smiled, thinking about the audience she would address. People who had dedicated their careers to protecting families, reforming institutions, and ensuring that children's rights were respected and protected. Many of them had been inspired by the Coleman sisters' story, but all of them represented the principle that had guided their work from the beginning. The belief that families belonged together and that society's responsibility was to support that unity rather than undermine it. The conference planning occupied much of the following weeks, but Sarah made time for what had become one of her most important traditions, the monthly visit to Millbrook Station, where a small memorial now marked the place where 6 desperate sisters had nearly frozen to death while waiting for salvation that came in the form of a giant cowboy who understood that helping people in trouble was not charity, but investment in the kind of community you wanted to live in. The memorial consisted of a simple bronze plaque that read, "In memory of all children separated from families by systems that forgot children are people, not problems to be processed. In honor of all advocates who fight to keep families together. In recognition that love, courage, and determination can overcome any obstacle." But more than a memorial to the past, the site had become a symbol of hope for families still fighting their own battles. Sarah often found letters left at the memorial, notes from parents seeking strength to continue custody fights, siblings thanking the Coleman sisters for proving that families could win against impossible odds, children expressing gratitude that their own families had been kept together because of precedents established 25 years earlier. Standing at the memorial on a crisp October morning, Sarah could see in the distance the lights of the Thompson Ranch, where Emma was visiting with her own children, where the twins were helping Jake plan improvements to the horse training facilities, where Rebecca was working on educational curriculum that would teach the next generation about family rights and civic responsibility. The circle was complete, but the story continued. Each family they helped represented another chapter in the ongoing narrative of child welfare reform. Each legal victory established precedent for future cases. Each successful family preservation demonstrated that love and determination could triumph over bureaucratic indifference and institutional convenience. As Sarah prepared to return to Helena and the national conference that would bring together advocates from across the country, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed 6 desperate young women into leaders of a movement that had changed the fundamental nature of child welfare in America. The giant cowboy who had said, "You're all coming home," had kept his promise in ways that extended far beyond providing shelter from a winter storm. He had helped them discover their own strength, their own purpose, their own power to create change in a world that too often seemed indifferent to human suffering. The Coleman sisters had indeed come home, not just to a place of safety and security, but to a mission that gave meaning to their survival, purpose to their struggle, and hope to countless other families facing similar challenges. Their legacy would continue through the advocates they had trained, the policies they had influenced, the legal precedents they had established, and most importantly, through the principle they had proven beyond doubt, that families belonged together, that love was stronger than law, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage began with a simple declaration of determination to protect those who could not protect themselves. The story that had begun with 6 freezing sisters at a remote train station had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. And that story would continue, generation after generation, as long as there were families to protect and advocates willing to fight for them. In the end, the Coleman sisters had discovered something more valuable than safety, more lasting than victory, more powerful than any law or policy, the understanding that their greatest strength lay not in what they had endured, but in what they had built from their endurance, a legacy of hope, protection, and unshakable faith in the power of family love to overcome any obstacle. They had all come home, in every sense that mattered, And they had made it possible for countless others to come home as well. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.